Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
What is it about grizzly bears that intrigues us or scares us? They are magnificent apex predators that long have been vilified by some, while admired by others. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Enter the national park system, and you often find yourself in a landscape with bears. In the east, you'll find black bears in Great Smoky Mountains, Shenandoah, and Acadia national parks, just to name 3 destinations with the bruins. Head west, and many parks have black bears roaming the countryside, with a few parks also being home to grizzlies. In today's show, we're going to be talking bears, mainly grizzly bears, with Kevin Grange, a Wyoming writer who has a book coming out in September called Grizzly Confidential. It's an interesting read that opens many windows into bears and their mannerisms and how they interact with humans. We'll be back in a minute with Kevin.
Smoky's Life, full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smoky's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smoky's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It is also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference too at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome back to the Traveler, Kevin.
Thanks, Kurt. I'm thrilled and honored to be back and looking forward to a fun conversation.
So, the last time we talked, you had just come out with a book on your exploits as a EMT, I guess, working in parks in Yellowstone and Grand Teton in Yosemite. And now you're coming back with a book on grizzly bears. I guess grizzly bears specifically as opposed to bears in general, right?
Correct. Yep. Grizzly bears and then, the larger species brown bear. So I'd actually sort of really been interested in this idea prior to my last book, Wild Rescues, and I wasn't really landing the interviews with the biologists that I hoped. And I think, possibly they're a little suspicious of the press who just kind of wants to tell the same story of the ferocious bear. But when I let them know, I kind of approached them and just said, what do you wish people knew about brown bears? So they were kind of leading the narrative and the discussion. And then this time around, I got a lot of folks really interested and excited to speak with me.
Yeah. Well, I've got to ask, why bears? There have been quite a few books about bears over the years. What did you think had gone unsaid that needed another book on bears?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, growing up in New Hampshire, I was always fascinated with bears, first black bears. And then when I saw Tom Mangelson's catch of the day photo of the bears at Brooks, about to eat the salmon, jumping up the fall, I just kind of became captivated with brown bears. And then when I first saw my first brown bear at Yellowstone, it was just the most amazing experience. And so I think what I wanted to say is with this book is, as I mentioned, I think with these apex predators, whether it's bears, wolves, or great white sharks, they elicit kind of like a fight or flight response in folks, even just by hearing the name, let alone seeing them. And so I think I noticed that with me when 399 took her 4 cubs on a walkabout through my Jackson Hole neighborhood. I realized that I was fascinated with bears, brown bears, but I was also very fearful of them. And so as a firefighter and paramedic and former park ranger, I've been trained to kind of go into the places that frighten me and the idea that the best way out is through. So I said, as a writer, I want to just plunge into the brown bear world, speak to as many biologists as I can, join them in the field, and kind of meet grizzly bears face to face. And my goal is kind of learn as much as I can, see if I can understand them, and then answer the question of how can we coexist.
Yeah, yeah. Now, before we get too far down the road with your book, Grizzly Confidential, you've mentioned grizzly bears and you've mentioned brown bears, and basically it's the same species, correct?
Correct. Yeah, they're both Ursus arctos. And so, like, historically, grizzly bear was the term for bears kind of inland or in the interior that didn't have access to like marine environments. And brown bear was typically the term for like, the coastal brown bears. So I basically use the terms interchangeably, just because they are the same species.
Right. I just want to get that straight in case we've confused some listeners with a brown bear and a grizzly bear. Now, you kind of touched on this. You live in Jackson Hole, the gateway to Grand Teton National Park. Why do you think grizzly bears are such a huge draw at Grand Teton? I mean, usually we hear about bears involved in maulings, and yet the park visitors seem to go and search with them. It's somewhat the same in Yellowstone.
Sure. I think the bears here, a lot of them, particularly the sows with cubs, have just been raising their cubs along the roadside. So it's one of the unique experiences in the lower 48 states where you can bear view, these sows with cubs at a very close range. We recommend at least staying 100 yards away. And so there's multiple theories on that. Some think they're kind of staying near people to kind of get that human shield so the older adult males won't predate on the cubs. But then speaking with some of the biologists at Grand Teton Yellowstone, it's more the most dominant males are kind of getting those winter kill carcasses. And so the sows, which are a little lower in the hierarchy, they're kind of getting pushed to these secondary food sources like the biscuit root and whatnot, which kind of greens up right by the road. But yeah, people have just fallen in love with, 399. She's kind of like an ambassador. She's had 8 litters and raised, 18 cubs pretty much alongside the road here in Grand Teton. And it has its pros and its cons. I think the pros is that people are excited about bears and they're learning to understand them. And it kind of helps debunk that myth of just the ferocious bear because they're observing 399. And she has had some close encounters with folks that, ended well. So it's good in that respect that people, when you see a brown bear, it's like a peak experience of your life. You remember when it happened, where it happened, because they're kind of just like the epitome of wildness and wilderness. And then the shadow side of that is just the bear jams and a few of her cubs. I think one has been struck by a vehicle and a few had to be euthanized just because they were human conditioned to food and that type of thing. So there's pros and cons.
Yeah, I'm wondering with the visibility of bears like 399, who I think she's going on 30 years old almost. Do you think it possibly gives people a false image of bears, of grizzly bears, that they're harmless, as opposed to how powerful they are, and if you get on the wrong side of them, you have a lot of trouble on your hands?
Sure. I think it could. There's 2 things to make sort of a dangerous bear, human habituated and food conditioned. And that's when they start, walking on people's porches and breaking into the houses. So I guess if the bear is just human habituated, it's not necessarily a bad thing because they're just doing what they normally do. They're feeding, they're just kind of not paying attention to the humans. When they become food conditions, then it can get dangerous. But you mentioned a good point, and I do think with bison, people wanting a pet bison in Yellowstone, there's almost like this Disneyification of the animals that they're not wild. And so it happens with the bison. People want that selfie. And then what I've observed with brown bears is it's really unique that there's sort of like a siren song to the brown bear. Like, you want to get closer. I've been really close to brown bears and you almost want to like pet them. It's really weird. Whereas like other apex predators, like no one sees a shark and wants to swim closer to it, a great white shark or, that type of thing. But brown bears are just some connection that humans and bears have that it's lulling you closer. But as you mentioned, you always have to remain vigilant that they are dangerous animals, and there's no matter, you might think there's a relationship between the two, but there's not in the wild, and maintain that 100 yards distance, have the bear spray and everything else.
Right, right. Now, as we mentioned early on, you've worked in Grand Teton, in Yellowstone, and Yosemite, and black bears are the only bears in Yosemite National Park. Of course, in Yellowstone and Grand Teton, you've got black and grizzly bears. Is there a difference in attitudes to bears in those three parks from the visitors?
Well, Yosemite and Yellowstone or Grand Teton are interesting in that, to my knowledge, they're the only parks that have like a wildlife brigade or a bear brigade. Like Yosemite has a bear brigade specifically for the black bears. Grand Teton has a wildlife brigade for all wildlife, but mainly the bears. And so I think with the black bear, there's a little more comfort with having them in the area. They still don't want them food conditioned and that type of thing. But I think with brown bears, there's definitely more of a heightened respect for, hey, this thing is, an apex predator. And some of that comes with the bears. Like there's this theory that black bears kind of evolved in the forest. And so when they see a threat, they'll flee or they'll run up a tree, whereas brown bears evolved kind of on the tundra and ice sheets, and there's nowhere to go. So the brown bear, when threatened, the inclination is to charge. Maybe it's a bluff charge, whereas the black bear runs away. So I think just kind of knowing the bears, they're managed a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
And the bears in Yosemite, I mean, they're almost like big squirrels, you see them all around, and it's really a challenging thing for the bear brigade there, just because you have millions of people and a lot of bears. Same with the Smoky Mountains.
Yeah, yeah. And at Yosemite, I haven't heard any problems in recent years, perhaps, but I mean, there's many, many stories of Yosemite black bears tearing cars open to get for a gum wrapper or some other morsel of food. And so I'm just wondering if black bears are viewed as cuddly teddy bears in Yosemite, or are people like, that thing's going to destroy my car, I don't want to see him around.
I think it's a little bit of both, and I think a lot of it comes down to people's experience with bears. Like I wasn't really fluent in bear behavior prior to researching this book, and now I know so much more. Like you'll see a black bear walking down the trail around Jenny Lake, and like prior to this trip, I probably would have freaked out, but now I know that like bears are always kind of measuring the caloric return for the energy expended. So hey, if there's an easy trail, they're going to take that versus going through the brush. And then, the bear's following you, but maybe he's just taking that path of least resistance. So now I know more of like the signs of a bear in distress. And so it's really cool just to kind of know their behavior and understand them, and then just kind of work with them on the landscape. And I guess the main thing I've learned is signs of stress in a bear. And so I try to always never stress the bear or change its behavior. And if I notice a sign of stress, maybe it's just he's feeding on the sedge and he lifts his head, I'm just going to stop what I'm doing and kind of reassess, just because we are visitors in their environment.
Yeah, yeah. And bears can be pretty tolerant of human intruders on their landscape. I know once I was in Yellowstone, down on the south arm of Yellowstone Lake, and we were camping, and we had set up our camp and started a fire to cook dinner, and I noticed a grizzly bear about, I don't know, 300, 400 yards away, going through a meadow, just, looking for grubs or whatever. One of the members of our group was breaking up firewood to feed the fire, and it was really making a loud noise, like taking a hammer. And the bear totally ignored us. Didn't really show any signs of interest.
That's the ideal situation where, he's not attracted to your food. So it sounds like he hasn't been fed in the past, and he's just moving through the landscape. And that's kind of what we want here. As I mentioned, 399 took her 4 cubs all around Jackson, behind Albertsons, down through my neighborhood. But the goal is just to if the bears come through our neighborhood, just to have them keep moving and not stop and find a food reward. Maybe it's a bowl of pet food left out, maybe it's garbage, compost. But if you can keep the
Birdseed.
bear, yeah, exactly. Beehives. So that's kind of the goal, just having them move through these neighborhoods if, not get any like food reward. But
Yeah.
it sounds like a great experience in Yellowstone. And one thing I'll just mention is people always ask like best practice to stay safe in bear country. And one thing I like to say is like it depends where you are and what you're doing and also the season. So I can tell you that like a Yellowstone bears, which are often displaced and food stressed, they're a lot different than like a coastal brown bear who has as much salmon as he wants. Those coastal brown bears are kind of like, a guy sitting on his couch with his fridge right next to him, his remote control. They're a lot more laid back, whereas those bears in the lower 48, typically they're food stressed and a little more anxious. So, me seeing a Yellowstone bear while hiking even 100 yards away, like my heartbeat's going. Whereas in Katmai, you'll walk past the bear just sleeping, 20 feet away and you kind of get used to it.
Really?
Yeah, you don't try to walk that close, but sometimes they're so quiet and they're just sleeping right next to the path to the Brooks Falls platform. And it's, there's like a 600-pound brown bear just sleeping right there. But there's space tolerance up there. It's a lot more mellow because they're used to people. And the main thing is they're well fed. So they're a little more relaxed than some of these lower 48 bears.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point, and it makes me wonder here in the lower 48 with the parks that have bears, do the bears in some parks act differently than other bears? And by that I mean more tolerant of visitors and not so interested in human foods. I was in Mount Rainier National Park once with my wife when we were camped out, and I'd gone to the restroom, and all of a sudden it was breakfast time, and I hear her saying, "There's a bear! There's a bear!" And this I don't know how old the bear was, but it just jumped up on this guy's picnic table and just started chowing down on his breakfast. You don't hear about that happening too often anywhere else in the park system, and this was probably a rare event in Mount Rainier. But I do wonder if there's a difference in bear behavior in different parks because of how bears are managed and how visitors are educated.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of different thoughts, like with this idea of the human habituated bears, in a place like Teton, they might allow 399 to forage right next to the road and traffic to develop. Whereas up there in Canada, I went to a human bear conflict conference in Lake Tahoe. Their thought is it's easier to move or haze one bear versus manage a crowd of 200 people. So Grand Teton many times will let the bear forage there and they're managing the people, whereas up in Canada, they're more managing the bear and just moving the bear along. So there's lots of different schools of thought on namely habituation. Do you move them? Do you leave them? Pros and cons. So it's really complex, and I think every situation is different.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you did a heck of a lot of research in putting this book together. You traveled quite a few places in the U.S. and Alaska, which is part of the U.S., of course, and you took a bear safety class. What did you take away from it in terms of lessons learned? And is it necessary to practice spraying bear spray before you go out into the field?
I think so. Yeah, the class I took was taught by a Navy SEAL, and so they have some founding guidelines. They, do their missions with. One is like 2 is 1 and 1 is none. So, rather than just carry one bear spray, because if that fails, you're kind of left out in the dark. So he would recommend if you carry one bear spray, you should at least have another bear spray with you. Maybe your wife's carrying it. Or in some areas of Alaska, you might want to carry bear spray and a handgun. It all kind of depends, but just generally 2 ways to defend yourself. So that was interesting to learn. And then as far as the bear spray, I realized it should be able to be deployed in less than 3 seconds. So me having it in my backpack didn't really work. So I now carry it, on my hip, or I have like a binocular harness, a bino harness, and it can just rest right there. And, we think of like this simulated bear encounter where we see it running from like hundreds of yards away and you have time to prepare. But from talking to a lot of folks, it's more just like an explosion right next to you. And you really just have a few seconds to, deploy that bear spray. So I kind of learned that, just knowing to have it ready and also practicing to kind of have like what they call like automaticity through repetition. So it's just like you can do it really fast. And then I think through that class, I also learned, signs of bears in distress, which is, salivating, kind of the jaw popping. I also learned signs of a bear not in distress. Like I used to think when a bear stood up tall on its, hind legs, it was about to attack, because that's kind of, you see the bear mounts. But in reality, the bear is just trying to get a better view of you, or, a better scent smelling you. So I learned in that case, hey, he's just curious. He's kind of getting a sense of the scene. So yeah, the class was really interesting. And, we watched a lot of videos just to learn signs of bears in distress. And then, in Alaska, you'll have these subadults. So they're emancipated from mom, but they're not yet adult bears. And they're just curious. So they'll come up and approach you. And so that was a whole learning thing too, like a curious bear versus aggressive bear or a stressed bear. And then just kind of learning to work with that. So it's really an interesting class. And we heard from Todd Orr, he's a U.S. Forest Service employee, and he was mauled by a bear, but just kind of hearing, his thoughts. And I guess I kind of equate it to like driving a car. So hiking in bear country is like driving. You can't eliminate all risk, but you can mitigate it. Like with cars, we wear a seatbelt, we drive the speed limit, we have airbags. Whereas in bear country, we travel in groups, we make noise, we have the bear spray. And so any deviation of that, maybe I want to go trail running. I know I'm kind of amping up my risk a little bit because I'm not with a group. And then I'm going faster, kind of like going faster than the speed limit. So, I just know, hey, I'm increasing that risk a little bit. And maybe I make the decision, but maybe I'm going to jog in this open area where there's not normally bears. So it's all just kind of measuring the risk benefit ratio of what you're wanting to do.
Yeah, yeah. Some years ago, there was a Park City man who was up at Grand Teton National Park and staying, I think, at Jackson Lake Lodge. And he was a marathoner. And so he had gone out one morning to get his training run in. And he was by himself, and he started out, singing. So, the bears would hear him coming. And he just kind of got lost in his run and in the beauty, and he totally forgot about making noise and whatnot. And he was tackled and mauled pretty well by a bear, and lived to tell about it. Became a motivational speaker, actually. But yeah, you can never be too safe. I'm wondering, we talk about bear spray. And the last time I checked, it was $40 or $45 for a canister of bear spray that you hit the trigger and it's done in about 10 seconds, I think.
Sure.
Do you think the cost of that dissuades some people from buying it? Like, where are the odds? I'm here in Grand Teton for 3 days. Where are the odds I'm going to encounter a bear? I don't need to get bear spray.
Yeah, I think definitely the cost. And what these wildlife managers are trying to do, they're trying to make the right thing easy and also inexpensive. So you have that bear box right next to your campsite. So it's easy to put your food in there. So what we're doing here in Grand Teton, which is nice, is there's like bear spray rental programs.
Right.
And right at the airport, you can now get bear spray. So they're kind of speaking to that cost that you mentioned. And in speaking with Carrie Gunther, who's the biologist up there in Yellowstone, a lot of this comes down to messaging, which is why I think folks were excited to talk to me, just because writers and artists and podcasts like yourself is helping get the message out. But what he said is the messaging's really out with the backcountry folks, the backpackers. But he's saying the folks who do those day hikes, just like you mentioned, the messaging isn't really hitting them as much. They're the ones who are not carrying the bear spray. So I think their chances of an encounter with a bear is like 1 in every 230,000 hikers. Whereas in the backcountry, it's like 1 in 25 million. So it's like you say, there is some of that resistance for those day hikers. But what I learned in working at Yellowstone is once the summer comes, you're probably not going to see a grizzly because they kind of go interior and avoid the people, but they can also appear anytime at any moment. And
Yeah.
I've seen it, a young cub running through Old Faithful right as the geyser was about to go off, hundreds of people. So we are still in that wild area and they can appear at any time. So,
In your bear safety classes, did they mention anything about air horns? I mean, I've heard, air horns are just as effective as bear spray in scaring a bear away.
yeah, no, when I was bear viewing at McNeil River State Game Sanctuary in Alaska, they gave you an air horn. And I think that's another great option when I say that, idea of two is one and one is none. So maybe you carry an air horn and bear spray. So yeah, that definitely works. And it kind of depends on the bear. Like some of these bears in Alaska, you can just break a twig and they'll just race off like a scolded puppy, or Joy Erlenbach was another biologist. She would just kind of shake a garbage bag and just send them going. But I think it's good to try different things. So, and I also like this idea of like trigger points. So it's like maybe the bear's 50 yards away, you make some noise, you wave. As he comes closer, maybe you try a second stimulus like the air horn. And if he keeps coming closer, then maybe you have the bear spray. So just different layers of protection.
So, Kevin, in working on this book, you met with a lot of bear experts and guides experienced with bears. Did they all offer the same advice on how to deal with bears?
The basics they did, as far as hiking in a group, making noise, carrying bear spray, not traveling in those parts of the day when the bear is most active, dawn and dusk. But then they did have different management styles for the bears in their particular areas. And I think that comes down to, as we were mentioning, the types of bears, the type of recreation people are doing there. So there was some differing schools of thought. But as far as bear safety, they all agreed on that, best practices of securing attractants and whatnot. It's really an exciting time for brown bears because, they were put on the endangered species list in 1975 in the lower 48, maybe less than 200. And it's been a great conservation success story getting them back to now. There's, over 2,000 bears in the greater Yellowstone and northern continental divide ecosystem near Glacier. So they're kind of pushing out beyond the national parks. So when I say it's an exciting time, it's exciting because bears are appearing in areas where they haven't been for hundreds of years, but it's also challenging because now they're encountering these neighborhoods. And every biologist I was talking to is like, the wildland urban interface, that's where it's happening. Like that's the forefront of coexistence. Whereas back in the day, it was just in the national parks trying to get them recovered.
Right.
So yeah, it's happening and it's probably going to continue happening.
At one point you write that despite biologists and behaviorists' best efforts, bears continue to bust up theories and leave everyone baffled.
Sure. Yeah. Another thing I learned is just how intelligent these bears are and how complex they are. And one story I like to tell is Vital Ground Foundation, which is a land conservation group that wants to protect and connect habitats for brown bears and all the species underneath them. There's a video of they put an electrified deer carcass in the woods, and the bear tried to bite it 2 or 3 times. You can see it on YouTube, and it got shocked. And then the bear made the connection in his mind to go to the source and unplug it. So to me, that just kind of, and it wasn't like he's messing around. It was like he knew right to go to the source and unplug it. So he was able to make that connection. And Larry Van Dale, who's a biologist up on Kodiak Island, he's like, I don't even call myself a bear expert because they're so complex and they're so intelligent. Just when you think you have a theory, they reverse it. Like one theory he mentioned is that the old adult males always kill the cubs, which does happen, but he would see instances where there's this really old boar and he's palling around with these 2 newly emancipated subadults, and there goes that theory. And There's other stories of, sows adopting orphaned cubs and family groups spending time together. And that's kind of the fun thing about like Brooks Falls, the bear cam, because you get to know the bears as individuals and you can kind of see some of these behaviors that you hadn't seen previously.
Yeah, yeah. What's your take on these commercial bear operations? And I'm talking, if you're driving up to Yellowstone and going through Idaho, you'll come across Yellowstone Bear World, not too far from Idaho Falls. Or once you get into West Yellowstone, there's the Grizzly Discovery Center. What's your take on these operations?
Well, they're very different, and I kind of talk about both in my book. And the Yellowstone Bear World is sort of like a pop-up zoo or a roadside zoo, and so I think that's kind of geared towards families and young kids who want to see a bear. I think the danger with a place like that where you can feed the black bears, and in the book I signed up for their bottle feeding of the cubs, and then I went on the safari tour where we throw bread out to all the black bears. It's sort of like conditioning people with the idea that if you want that photo or that bear encounter, you're supposed to feed them. Whereas the counterpoint to that is the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center in West Yellowstone, which is amazing. The bears there are all kind of rescues. Some were orphans, some were getting into conflict. And the thing there is the whole emphasis is on not feeding the bears. And they do these live product tests where like a company has a cooler like Yeti or something like that, and they want to make it bear resistant. So that we'll bait it with peanut butter and fish and then lock it up and see if the bears can make access. And if the bears don't make access, it kind of gets a stamp from the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee that it's bear resistant. But an interesting thing is they never call it bear proof because we were talking about their intelligence. It's like give them enough time, they'll probably get in. But bear resistant, it can withstand that bear for over an hour. So yeah, they're very different parks, and I think one is kind of the roadside zoo, just animals as something to be just pet and fed, more like house pets. Whereas the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center, they're teaching a lot about the importance of predators on the landscape, and it's more about coexistence there, not feeding bears, and kind of getting to know the animal as like a complex, sentient being.
Right.
So yeah, they're very different.
Yeah, yeah. One is more like a show versus education.
Yeah, and maybe the show gets someone interested in bears, a little kid, but then they go to the next park and the interest gets a little more depth to it and that type of thing. So, maybe Yellowstone Bear World's a good entry point to bears, but I think only if you visit the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center afterwards.
Yeah, yeah. There you go. You mentioned Brooks Camp up in Katmai National Park. Of course, Brooks River, the famous bears, Fat Bear Week. Is that the best marketing plan ever for brown bears?
It's a good one, and people have just fallen in love with these bears like Otis and 747 and Grazer and Holly through the bear cams and also through the contest. So again, it's kind of like $3.99. It gets that public awareness, but it also brings hundreds of people. I think on Katmai and a busy day in July, you can get 300 to 500 folks at
Wow.
these platforms. So I guess there's a good balance to be had between getting folks excited about bears and not stressing the bear or displacing them by the sheer number of people.
Sure. But then, when Fat Bear Week rolls around in September, it's coming around, I think, and you've got that live webcam shooting images of these bears across the world. The reach must be phenomenal, and the lessons that people can pick up, not just enjoying watching the bears do what they do, but getting some understanding of their ecology and their behaviors and whatnot. It's really got to be incredible educational source.
Yeah, no, like you mentioned, I think I became fascinated with the bears on the bear cam. And then through that lens, I was able during my visit and also watching the webcams to learn how bears are like ecosystem engineers, kind of tilling the soil with their claws and dispersing seeds through their scat. All the salmon carcasses they discard, it brings nitrogen and phosphorus to the forest. So when I visited Brooks, I think initially I wanted to see Otis, who's one of my favorite bears, who likes to kind of sit in his office. But what I took away from that experience was just seeing this intact ecosystem, which was amazing, just kind of functioning on all cylinders, but also seeing how bears just engineer that ecosystem and how important they are to the landscape, and also like clean water and abundant salmon runs. So I think the Fat Bear Week drew me in, but then I was able to learn so many more things.
As you mentioned, grizzlies have been on the endangered species list since the last century, 1975. We're making progress, and yet they remain highly controversial. The Interior Department, the Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service went back and forth over a number of 4 or 5 years on whether or not to try to recover grizzly bears in the North Cascades ecosystem. At last glance, the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service have decided to go forward with it. Just this past week, an appropriations bill for the Interior Department was passed out by the U.S. House of Representatives, and in that there's a rider that would block recovery of grizzly bears in the North Cascades ecosystem. The local congressman says his constituents don't want to see grizzly bears in their backyards. You live in Jackson Hole, there's plenty of grizzly bears around there. Is the controversy over-manufactured, do you think?
I think so. I think some of it is just people not really knowing about bears and kind of like their true nature. And like the ranching community, they have some good arguments. But I think if the community wants brown bears, we all have to pitch in. It shouldn't just be, the owner of the ranch who has to pay for the electric fence or the carcass removal program or carcass reimbursement. We should all kind of share the cost. But I think some of it are these like age-old myths or disbelief, myths about brown bears that people have, maybe from watching these movies where they're just out to get you and they're ferocious and everything. So that's some of it. But I also think sometimes, like I was speaking with Dr. Chris Servine, who led the recovery effort for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And he said a lot of times, like at the town meetings, it tends to attract only the folks who are against the brown bears. But there are folks who support brown bear recovery, but they're not always the one interviewed for the newspaper. Or they're not always the one that show up. So I think what this book tries to do is just, I acknowledge that there is conflict, and I talk about that in a few chapters, but I also acknowledge that there's a lot of solutions. And if we all kind of work together, ultimately we share the same goal. And that's what Chris Servine was saying. You ask a rancher, hey, I don't want bears killing my cattle. And Chris would say, I don't want bears killing your cattle either. So you kind of find that common point and then just expand on that. But bears, some people think of them as a net loss on the landscape, but they also bring a lot of things, as I was mentioning, as far as like the ecosystem effects, but also like, the tourism dollars that supports the local economy. So there's lots of benefits as well, but I think sometimes initially we only hear the negative things.
Sure. We went through that back in the 90s with the Wolf Recovery Program for Yellowstone National Park. And I think since then, a lot of people have learned how to live with wolves. We've learned how to better protect livestock from wolf predation. We've seen tourism skyrocket in the communities in and around Yellowstone National Park. It brings in millions, tens of millions of dollars a year because people want to see a wolf in the wild. So it's interesting, but you do have these impacts, and I think Defenders of Wildlife started a reimbursement program for ranchers who could prove that their livestock were killed by wolves. I think there's another program for homeowners in the Paradise Valley if bison coming out of Yellowstone damage their gardens or fences or whatnot. And I guess we're going to see the same thing with grizzly bear recovery. If it can be demonstrated that a grizzly bear took down this cow or this sheep or whatnot, somebody will try and reimburse them. I don't know if that totally mollifies the situation or not.
Right. Yeah, I think it definitely helps, just because the ranching community feels like they're being heard, they're getting some of that monetary compensation, and um, it is challenging. So I definitely respect that. But I think we all kind of pitch together, and hopefully those bears in the North Cascade, just stay away from the neighborhoods, and there's a great intact ecosystem up there going up even into like British Columbia. So generally bears just want to be left alone. They want to their whole goal is to just put on that weight and get the nutrition that they need prior to hibernation. And, so hopefully they're out there and it's a successful recovery if it moves forward.
Yeah, yeah, it is a rather large swath of landscape up there. I can't remember exactly the number, but it is a big piece of rugged wildlands for the bears to go to. So we're wrapping this up. What advice do you have for listeners thinking of visiting a national park with resident bears or those who are deathly afraid of bears?
I think, just have the understanding that bears aren't out to get you. They don't like surprises, and they're just trying to go about their business. And so I would read about what park you're going to and what type of bears are there. Are they black bears? Are they brown bears? And then, if you don't want to see one, you can always ask a ranger as to like the best trails to hike, because there are certain areas where the bears tend to gravitate to. Follow the best practices for staying safe in bear country. And I think the most important thing is just securing your food and attractants, which could even be like lipstick and deodorant and all that sort of thing. That's the number one thing to like prevent conflict, and also to like pre-plan. I was actually at String Lake yesterday in Grand Teton doing some stand-up paddleboarding, and there's a lot of black bears in the area, and some of them have learned that if you approach a picnic table, everyone runs, and then you have a free buffet.
Right.
So with your, say you and I were camping or having a picnic at String Lake, we pre-plan like, hey, if a bear comes, I'll stay with the food and make noise while you maybe move the food to. So you kind of pre-plan what you're going to do if you have a bear encounter.
Yeah.
And again, 99.9% of the encounters aren't aggressive. It's, just a curious bear, but having a plan of what to do.
Do these parks have regular bear programming, so to speak, that if you're coming to Grand Teton from Massachusetts, for instance, where there are no grizzly bears, you can attend a ranger program to learn more about grizzlies and their behavior and how they operate, so to speak, in Grand Teton?
I'm not sure. I think they have that kind of program. I'd have to ask Justin, my biologist friend up there. One thing they've done is just signage everywhere.
Yeah.
Bathrooms, trailheads, but also to like the signage in Grand Teton is the same as Yellowstone. So they're reinforcing that. It's on the map, so they're just kind of reinforcing that message everywhere you go and everywhere you look. My suspicion is they probably do have those ranger-led talks, both at Grand Teton and Yellowstone, because people love the bears. It's universal. I think even people that don't want bears in their neighborhood, they still love to see them in the wild.
Sure. So your book is coming out in September, I believe, and where can people get it?
Pretty much everywhere books are sold. So, your local independent bookstore is a great option, just because I kind of look at the independent bookstores as like the heartbeat of the book industry. They're the ones just making those recommendations. So I love to support those small businesses. It's also online, and then we'll be doing an audio book and an ebook. So,
oh, nice.
Yeah.
Who's going to read? Who's going to do the reading for the audiobook?
Yeah, they threw it out to me, but since I interviewed over 30 people, I was just like, I can't handle all these accents and voices, and so I think you need a professional, just based on the sheer number of people I interviewed.
I think you need Sam Elliott.
Yeah, he'd be great. Definitely. He's a legend.
Well, Kevin, thanks so much for joining us today. Again, the book is called Grizzly Confidential by Kevin Grange. It's going to be coming out in mid-September. Keep an eye out for it. It's got some incredible stories in there that will really open your eyes both in bear behavior and bear incidents that people have managed to survive. Kevin, thanks again, and best luck with your sales.
Thanks so much for having me. I had a great time.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. Keep an eye out for bears the next time you visit a national park that they call home, and check with rangers to see if there's a program where you can learn more about bears and how to be safe around them. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.